Now, since this is not a course on building an API, I have, for the purpose of this course, included a fully working API that we can use as well. I've used ASP.NET Core to build this API. In this demo, let me take you through that API. I'm going to show you the API next. It is in fact again included with the assets that come with the downloads of this course. If you go to M5, in there you'll find an API project, Bethany's PyShop HRM.api. Copy that folder to your solution folder and then add it to the solution by going to Add Existing Project again and then selecting the API project. I will take you through the API very briefly. It's a regular API built with ASP.NET Core, so it's a .NET 6 project again. If you go to the launch settings here under Properties, we'll see that the API can run on port 7039. So localhost 7039 will be the URL that we can address to talk with the API. In the program CS, we'll add the required services to the dependency injection container, and we'll also add the required middleware. We'll use EF Core to talk with the database. The data is actually going to live in a database that sits behind the API. In the app settings, I've defined the connection string named default connection. As they're using DIL block here, I'm specifying that I'm going to use a DB context, and the data will actually need to be retrieved from SQL Server using this connection string. We're going to use a couple of repositories, and those I register here. I'll show you those in just a minute. And I've also added course so that from any URL, any header, and any method are allowed. We're going to use add controllers here. That is basically adding support for MVC, the MVC-based pattern, but we're not using add controllers with views since this is just an API project. And also Swagger is added to be able to browse to the OpenAPI endpoint. In the middleware, there's some default set of middleware that is being added already. For example, we have the support for static files, routing is enabled, authorization is enabled, course is plugged in, that's that policy that was defined just a minute ago, and we also specify an endpoint for controllers, and finally we call app.run, which will start up the application and it will listen for incoming requests. Now, in terms of controllers, there's a couple of controllers that I have defined. The employee controller, let's take a look at that one first. It's addressable via this route, so API / the name of the controller, so API / employee for this one. I've also added the API controller attribute, and I inherit from controller. In this version of the employee controller, so not taking into account what is commented out, I use an iEmployee repository, which is plugged into dependency injection, as we can see here. Constructor injection is used to pass in an instance of the employee repository. The mapping was defined here inside of the program.cs. I've then defined a couple of methods on the API. The HTTP get all employees will return via the employee repository all employees. I have the ability to pass in an ID and get an employee by ID. I also can create an employee, which receives the employee in the body. In there, I will perform a few checks. If the employee is null, then I return a batch request. I also have a business rule defined here that states that the employee first name and last name should not be empty. If the model is not valid, well, then I'm going to return a batch request, meaning that these business rules were probably violated. We'll skip over the commented out code for now, and I will create the employee using the repository and return a 201 created. The update employee is pretty similar, as we can see here. And I've also created a delete employee, which accepts an ID. Let's quickly look at the repositories inside of the models folder. So on the iEmployee repository, I have defined these methods, the get all, the get by ID, add, update, and delete. And those are implemented inside of the employee repository. And in there, I inject the AppDB context again via dependency injection. To get all employees, I ask the AppDB context for the employees. The by ID will do a first or default, passing in the employee ID. The add employee will attach an employee to the employees DB set and then call save changes, and it will also return the added entity. Update employee will first retrieve the employee from the AppDB context, update it, and then call save changes. And there's also a delete employee, but I think we can figure out what that one will do. Next to the employee controller, there's also a country controller, which is very similar. It uses a country repository, which is injected again through dependency injection, and we have a get countries and a get country by ID. And very similarly, the job category controller can be used to retrieve all job categories or a job category by ID. Now finally, let's take a look at the AppDB context. I haven't shown you that one yet. In the AppDB context, we of course have a couple of DB sets defined: employees, countries, and job category. In the on-model creating, I've used the hasData to seed the database with some initial data. If there's no data in my database yet, then this seed data will be added. Now, of course, for that to happen, I need to create a migration. I'm going to go to View, Other Windows, and then Package Manager Console. Make sure to set the API project as the default project. Then I'm going to create an initial migration by saying add migration, so add dash migration that is. I'm going to give it a name, initial migration. And that will indeed create an initial migration class, which has an up method that will create the countries, job category, and employees table. And it will also include that data that I have defined inside of the DB context. I go back to my Package Manager console and I now call update database. This has now successfully created my database. If I now run the application, so with the API project set as the startup, we'll get the Swagger endpoint that we can then use to test our API. In our Swagger endpoint, let us, for example, ask to get back all employees. And we did get, in this case, just one employee because I had just inserted one employee in the DB context. If we look, for example, at countries, we call API/country, that will do a get to get all countries from the API. And this is, of course, now data that comes from the database. That's what we need in our Blazor application.